This video is going to be about focus and specifically periodic refocusing. So I did a video a little while ago about adaptive focus, and I'll put a link in the description for this video. So if you're going to use if you're going to use adaptive focusing, then that's an alternative way of keeping your scope in focus during a session. Ekos does, however, also have some other ways of doing the same thing in this pop-up here of capture called limits. So at the top there's some parameters that are related to guiding, and then at the bottom there are another set of parameters related to periodic refocusing. So this is kind of the main way of doing periodic refocusing. The other way is to set up your filters, if you have a filter wheel, such that when you switch in a new filter you can automatically refocus. So the way to do that is just to configure in the filter settings autofocus to run when a filter swaps in. So that's another way of getting a sort of an in sequence autofocus. But I'm going to focus on this pop-up and the various ways that you can generate an autofocus in sequence. So there are 4 tick boxes here. You can select which ones you want, and the checks will be performed associated with whichever of these options you've selected. So probably the easiest way to describe this is to just set up a sequence and just talk it through as it runs. So what I would do is just pick what you want in terms of a series of exposures. Select in here which options you want and how you want to configure it. So in my case I've just ticked everything. So what I'll do is I'll just save this sequence, which will persist the various items that you've got in the table, along with the contents of this limits pop-up. So when you bring the pop-up, so when you load the sequence up, it'll bring back however you've configured this pop-up. So for instance, if I just untick all of this and then reload my sequence, you'll see that everything comes back as it was when I saved it. Now what that means is when you use the scheduler and you load various sequences, as each of the sequences gets loaded in order to be processed throughout the night, each of the sequences will have its own version of how this pop-up looks, and it will be loaded as the sequence is loaded by the scheduler. So I'm not going to use the scheduler for this because we'll just add a bit more time to the video. But what we'll do is we'll just start running this sequence. And it's just going to start off by doing a focus. Now, whilst that's going, I'll just talk about the first item here. So this is just going to refocus on time. So every time autofocus runs, it will reset the timer, and whatever you have in this field, in my case 1 minute, it will monitor the sequence, and when 1 minute has elapsed it will force an automatic refocus between subframes. So in my case I've got 15-second frames, so after 4 of those subframes it'll do an autofocus. The next item down, I'll just talk over this whilst we get to 4 frames. The next item down here is a temperature deviation. So you set up, in my case I've set up 1 degree centigrade. So basically when autofocus runs, it will record the temperature. So in this case temperature was 0, and it's saying a delta temperature of 0, so i.e. the temperature's not moved since we last ran autofocus. So if that delta temperature exceeds 1 degree, so it's either gone to +1 or -1 in the case of this example, then that will also re-trigger an autofocus. And when autofocus runs, it will reset its temperature. And here we go, this is the time-based autofocus. So 4 frames came in, which is a minute. There's a message here saying schedule refocus starting after 68 seconds. And obviously what it's doing is it's going off running autofocus. So obviously after that autofocus is run, then it'll just continue with the 5th exposure in this sequence. So having run autofocus, the time will be reset, and in another 1 minute it'll rerun autofocus again. I mean, I think generally people would set this to like 60 minutes or a couple of hours or whatever is appropriate for your equipment. Probably the best way to see how to or what to set that to, you know, start off with, let's say, 60 minutes. Have a look at the frame just before autofocus, and have a look at the subframe just after. And if you know, if you see that there's a significant deviation in HFR, then you might want to consider, you know, autofocusing more frequently. If there's not much difference, then you know, you could look to you know, autofocus less frequently. Okay, so down onto I guess we're going to have another time-based autofocus here on the 8th frame. So scheduled refocus after 69 seconds. So it's just going to run another autofocus. So whilst that's running, I'll prepare to change the temperature and generate another autofocus, just so you can see that working. Right, so that one's completed. Temperature 0. I'm in a simulation environment, so I can just adjust the temperature. So if I put this to 1.1, which is above the 1 degree threshold, back in focus, you can see delta temperature 1.1. So the refocus on delta temperature greater than 1 degree centigrade has been triggered, and off it's going, doing another autofocus. So whilst that runs through, I'll talk about the third option here, which is refocus on delta HFR. This has changed just recently. So in the current stable version, it won't look exactly like this, but in the new version coming out at the end of the month or beginning of February, this change will be there. So basically, the system will run a check between subframes depending on what you have here. So if you want to check every frame, it'll do that. If you want to check every 3rd frame, you can set this to 3, and that's what it'll do. Now, if I just clear that out, you can kind of see what's happening. But what's going to happen is between subframes, it's going to make a call into focus, and focus will take another exposure and measure the HFR. And it'll measure and having measured the HFR, it'll compare it to this threshold here. So in this case, the HFR was 1, and 1 is less than the 1.07, so it didn't trigger an autofocus. I guess we've just got another refocus every minute coming in here. But how this works basically then is in this case, I've selected an algorithm of last autofocus. So it takes whatever the HFR was from the last autofocus, applies a threshold, in my case 10%, and it gives you this number. So HFR was 0.98, add 10%, you get 1.07, 1.08, and that's the threshold it's going to check against. So in this case, it's come in, done another check on the next subframe, and the HFR of 0.99 here is less than the 1.08, so it's not triggered an autofocus. Now, if I just knock this slightly out of focus, it found an HFR of 1.11. It's just been overwritten, unfortunately. The HFR of 1.11 is above the 1.08 threshold, and therefore that's enough to trigger an autofocus on a change in HFR. So that's what it's doing now. So I've obviously just kind of manipulated this a little bit, in the simulation environment to do that, but it's kind of shows you the way that this works. The other way to do it, or the other algorithms you can use, is you can select a fixed algorithm, and that'll just take whatever you put in here. So if I put 1.5, then that will be the threshold that it's going to use for the whole of the sequence. The third algorithm down here is the way this process used to work, which is a kind of it's an algorithm that takes a combination of both the autofocus data and the measured HFR when the HFR check runs between subframes, and it maintains a list of that data. And then the algorithm basically, every time an item is added to the list, either because autofocus runs or because the HFR check runs, it'll add the new data point to the list, and it will change the check value in here to be the middle value of that list. I don't really know why. I could sort of guess why it does that, but I think it's a somewhat specialist use of this process. I think generally people would use the last autofocus, and if they wish, they could obviously use the fixed value, but I think the last autofocus value is probably the easiest to understand. The fourth option on here, refocus off the Meridian Flip, does kind of exactly what it says. So the Meridian Flip will run, and when it completes, the focus process would be triggered to run again. So again, for some setups that would be helpful, for others it might be unnecessary. Again, a way to check that would be take a look at the last frame before a Meridian Flip, and then if you have this option unchecked, have a look at the first frame after the Meridian Flip and compare the HFRs, and if they're a bit different, then it probably means that it would make sense to switch this option on. If they're about the same and consistently the same, then you probably don't need the option. There's no harm in doing it. It will just obviously take a little bit longer to complete, so it'll be slightly less imaging time and more focusing time. And that's kind of it, I think. As I mentioned at the start, these options are persisted per sequence. So if in the scheduler you had a number of sequences, you could set different values for these parameters. That probably for most people they wouldn't do that, but it is possible. And just one last point, which I think might be quite useful. I find this quite useful. If you're in the middle of a sequence and for some reason focus has not done what you wanted it to do. So in my case, it's usually that I've been testing some software and I've got some parameters set probably suboptimally for imaging, because I've been testing something and I've forgotten to set them back, and I've started a sequence. It's it's slewed to the target, it's plate solved, it's loaded the sequence, and it's taken, it's probably done another focus, and I've realised that everything is not quite perfect. So what I would do historically is I'd probably stop the sequence, reset focus parameters to how they were, and then start it up again, and then you have to go through the whole initiation process again, which obviously works, but it just wastes a bit of time. But one thing you can do with the refocus on HFR check is you can just temporarily set this to a very low value. I'll just fire up this sequence again and show you. You can set, if you have this, for instance, on an algorithm of last autofocus, you can set it to an artificially low value, and that will force an autofocus. So the sequence is just firing up. I'll let this initial autofocus complete, and then I'll demonstrate it. But it's kind of handy because it means that ad hoc you can force an autofocus at any point within a schedule without having to stop and restart the schedule, which I think is quite useful. So just to demonstrate this, we've got this schedule running. It's downloaded the first subframe. So the HFR on the check was 0.98. So if I just set this to 0.5, the next subframe check will come in after the sub, which it's just done. So it's come in, the check has found that the HFR was 0.99, which is obviously above the threshold value of 0.5 here that I've set. So it's now just triggered an autofocus. So that autofocus is going to run through. I don't need to actually do anything else now, because with this algorithm of last autofocus, it's got the HFR of 0.99 added 10%, and it's reset the threshold to 1.09. So that sequence can now run through. So anyway, that's a little tip. Hopefully you'll find that useful. So that's it. Please comment or ask any questions that aren't clear.